Hey folks, welcome. If anybody's in the bookstore who wants to join in for the author event, we're going to get started over here. If you haven't been here before, you're at Firestorm. Just a little bit of quick housekeeping. We've got bathroom over there on your far right. If the light's not on, it'll come on as you step into the hall. We've got exits both behind you over here and then probably the door you came in. So feel free to get up and stretch your legs and get some fresh air if you need that at any point. And if you need a hand with anything, you can find me or one of my collective mates probably over by the register or floating around. So just let us know. Be happy to help you. Really appreciate you all coming out today on a beautiful Saturday for a conversation that I think will be really fantastic. We're excited to have David Vaina here, who recently published On Ramps to a New Civil Society, Mutual Aid at the Edges of the Anthropocene. You can find copies of that book right up front by the register. And for anybody who's joining remotely, you can find it on our website. So before we kick things off, I just wanted to do quick bios for the folks who are on our panel and also really appreciate Ben and Chelsea today for sitting in as our local organizer representatives. There's obviously been a lot of really incredible mutual aid organizing here in Western North Carolina over the last 8 months. And of course, going back further, but it'll be nice to kind of take a big conversation and then bring it into the local and also hear from y'all today in the audience. So quick bios here. David has helped fund, develop, and operate Florida nonprofits over the last 15 years. Outside the formal civil society, David has organized many workshops and helped working class people realize food sovereignty and a decentralized, sustainable food system. For several years, he's taught history in the Florida prison system. Currently, he serves as the chair of his local Sierra Club, and his political work is most focused on reducing energy burdens and building energy democracy. David has a PhD in political theory and writes regularly on climate change and politics for the Invading Sea and others. Also, we've got Chelsea White-Hogan today, who is a proud Appalachian who grew up in Western North Carolina and has been weaving networks of community care and direct action here for over a decade. Chelsea's work centers around the co-creation of autonomous alternative means of collective survival in poor rural communities as a means of combating the culture of white supremacist capitalism. And then last but not least, Ben here on my left is an organizer with the Mutual Aid Disaster Relief Hub in West Asheville and a coordinator for the Asheville Regional Coalition for Home Repair, Archer. So thank you. Thanks to all three of you so much for taking time out and being here today. Can't wait to hear from you. I'm going to go ahead and pass off to David to say a little bit more about this new book.
How's my sound okay, everybody? Okay, cool. Thanks for Liberty's organizing here in this great space, and I'm very happy to make the trip up from Gainesville up to Asheville. It's great to be here. I've been here since I was in high school, which was, I'm not going to tell you how long ago that was, but it was a while. So I'm going to just read a little bit about, just speak a little bit about my book from a more kind of theoretical perspective. And it's great to have panelists that are practitioners to sort of put, kind of muscle behind the ideas. So often when you write a book, you always wish you'd put stuff, you see it and you're like, oh, I wish I'd put that in. And I'm very guilty of that. So there's a quote from a French political philosopher that I think really helped me really kind of see mutual aid as an idea and just in a very broad perspective. And I'm very interested in like dichotomies, comparing like one thing or another. And this quote compares politics and police. So here's the quote. Politics is specifically opposed to the police. The essence of the police is to be a partition of the sensible characterized by the absence of a void or a supplement. Society consists of groups dedicated to specific modes of action in places where these occupations are exercised and modes of being corresponding to these occupations in these places. In this fittingness of functions, places, and ways of being, there is no place for a void. It is this exclusion of what there is not that is the police principle at the heart of statist practices. The essence of politics, then, is to disturb this arrangement by supplementing it with the part of the no part identified with the community as a whole. political litigious struggle is that which brings politics into being by separating it from the police. That is, in turn, always attempting its disappearance, either by cruelly densing it or by subsuming that logic of its own. Politics is first and foremost an intervention upon the visible and the sayable. So for me, politics is a refusal to participate in the dominant order. But this isn't just a negative process. It's here about making room for discovery, creating, and innovating. Where politics are not something, politics is not something we just watch, vote for every 2 to 4 years, but politics that we do creatively, collectively, and with new kinds of relationships between people, where we create a new political intelligence. You'd find this everywhere in history and even contemporary history, where politics is done radically and outside existing sites of power, such as capital government, even nonprofits, and even maybe the family. So historically, you could think of the Paris Commune, the early Soviets in 1905, the Zapatistas, and from our own nation, the Black Panther Party. So we need to identify the fires that are already lit today. Where can we find things to feel good about in these really dark times? How do we crowd out capitalism? And that's where I feel mutual aid fits in. So this is an anarchist bookstore, and the springboard for my project was a political philosopher that's no longer with us, that just died about a year ago, named Antonio Negri, who spent about 13 years in prison over his life by the Italian government. It's kind of have a Hollywood story. You Google and see about his life, but he was very optimistic about our potential, the human potential as collective beings to produce not wealth, but social wealth. And what I think might be one of his most interesting legacies was that Negri put socialists and anarchists in conversation. He's always been, well, you're an anarchist, no, you're a Marxist, and he didn't really care. He made a point to say he wasn't an anarchist, but I think if you read his stuff, you're not really sure, and I think that's what makes him such a beautiful writer. But his emphasis is how important it is for social movements and radical social practices like mutual aid to emphasize organization. And I think that's his critical point for whatever you want to call yourself, socialist, an anarchist, or nothing. A lot of people, I had hosted some comrades from South Florida recently for a conference. I didn't know them. They were much younger than me. And we're talking about theory, and they just kind of laughed at me. They're like, it's not something I'm not anything, and they're like, well, why did, what a question. It was kind of a real aha moment for me, but they were truly radical. So when I was reading about mutual aid and doing something for myself and seeing all these meetings, all the Google Docs, all the formal strategies that were put into place after endless emails, texts, signal messages, the commitment to consensus decision-making, and decentralized government structures, I realized that mutual aid is not a miracle and not something spontaneous. This was people doing a lot of boring grunt work that was made this happen. What were in fact actually new kinds of institutions. And perhaps that's where, that maybe is not necessarily seen as an anarchist practice, but institution making at a time when institutions are crumbling, I think is important to offer an alternative. Trotsky wrote about, just meetings. And, here's a quote from him: "Yet at the same time with the chaos, there arose a need for a new order, and elements of that order began to crystallize. Regularly recurring meetings in themselves introduced the principle of organization." I think any of us have organized how hard it is just to get meetings, just to get people to come, just to organize them and get them, to meet everybody's schedule and get active participation. But I think when you start doing that, you realize you don't need bosses to run your own meetings. And it's a big first gesture, I think, in becoming autonomous. So the backdrop of the book, what I really see the motor of history is the climate crisis. I know in Nashville that's very top of mind. It has been in Florida for many decades. But this doesn't discount other variables that you may see as kind of contributing to our crisis right now. But I see it as the main driver shaping our way of living, including even how we work, and a permanent crisis as it appears. And perhaps not just like the devastation that happened here last year, but more of a slow burn one. And I think a lot of this mutual aid I'm seeing, like in New Orleans, it started as really kind of a, hey, we need something after Katrina, but that was 20 years ago. And there's some of these projects are still hanging around. So, when you think about even going back further and what I would continue with my kind of climate change point here, is so much of colonization was based on finding cheap nature, energy, food, raw materials. and cheap labor, even free labor. So, slavery, murder, it was estimated by 1650 that 95% of all indigenous inhabitants of the so-called New World had died. So cheap doesn't mean a low price, but it's a strategy built on exploitation and extraction. But what happens when capitalism can't access cheap nature and cheap labor anymore, and seeking to overcome our current climate crisis? I think it just really looked a lot of time at like crop yields, yield suppression. What's due to droughts and flooding, super weeds, super pests, super diseases, lower productivity because it's so hot for workers, and they're not going to pass legislation to protect workers. Construction workers in Florida. We've tried to pass bills just to give people water breaks during the summer when they're putting roofs on, and and seen as some kind of real radical thing. So eventually people are just not going to be doing this work anymore. They just can't do it. So in this void that I mentioned before, is there an opportunity for something new other than more capitalism? Is it really a crisis of a particular kind of society like the one we have now and hate? And parallel to this is refusal of work under these conditions. There is therefore still human agency amidst our ecological destruction, I believe. And there's a historical precedent for people power. Haiti's slave revolt back in the 1800s was done by people who didn't want to be slaves anymore, not just soil exhaustion. So it's not like automatically climate change is going to turn everybody into a revolutionary. There's going to be a lot of work to be done, but I looked at our capacity to do things historically and contemporary, and there's a lot of it. I want to look at mutual aid as a radical form of labor or work, which I don't think a lot of people do, is specifically see it as a labor practice. And in the book, I gave the labor in mutual aid a new name, what I call social regeneration labor. There's definitely overlap between how this labor operates in some indigenous societies. But for me, the inspiration was from ecological socialism and ecological feminism, critiques that reject any hierarchy or distinction between the human and non-human worlds. So increasingly, I'm seeing mutual aid focused on how the natural world needs to be healed and renewed, not just people. So it's not necessarily doing that in a one-to-one ratio, but that is becoming this new labor form. And labor that's happening outside of our 9-to-5 lives. Social regeneration labor, kind of looking ahead, is both wage and unwage, operates alongside existing forms of labor, and also incorporates and builds off the way the earlier forms of labor are organized and realized. But again, its focus is to heal people in a degraded environment. So we need life as a fear without fear and sickness that have to be restored in order for there to be political power. We have to be healed, to feel better about our work. And I'll read just a little bit, a passage on page 40, 45 and 46 about this form of labor, the social regeneration labor, just to give you a little bit of sense. Even if the predictive data on climate change is only partially accurate, a crisis management and recovering process of both nature and society will need to be activated en masse and on a more generalized scale. If labor is seen as central, and specifically labor directed towards both the human and non-human worlds, and realized in anti-capitalist and radically democratic ways, it is important to better understand the complete essence of work that actualize these principles. This social regeneration labor is already emerging and is both quantitatively and qualitatively evident. Social regeneration labor is both reflective of and different from any historical or existing practice. Thus, one certainly sees an overlap with communitarian labor and social practices of indigenous and peasant societies, whose practitioners understand that decolonization combines the powers of cultures and traditions with the invention of new cultures. But because it is developing in a specific global context, and one that's still unfolding in the context of climate change, it must be an original project leading to a new and different global order. It is perhaps more useful to concretize this form of labor not as a career, but instead a labor practice that encompasses numerous combinations of activities, evidence at both the macro and micro social levels, and across a range of professions: educators, healthcare workers, counselors, healers, therapists, clergy, parents, water protectors, land defenders, farmers, gardeners, composters, fishers, foragers, engineers, and builders. Peace advocates will likely need to be included, as an estimated 10 to 30% of all global environmental degradation is due to military-related activities. Thus, no one has in their job description social regeneration, but each performs work that is critically purposed towards restoring both humans and the non-human world that's been impaired by climate disruption. So that gives you a little sense of sort of our existing jobs, the kind of work we do, and where I see it as all bundled and all kind of mixed up, and people doing all of them, some of them, kind of the unsung hero as a labor. I guess if you're going to have a job title on your resume, would be a community organizer. They do a lot of everything. So how is mutual aid anti-capitalist? It is about who controls the production process, from soup to nuts, planning, production, and distribution. Who controls how long you work, the schedule, and the action items? And how do you decide to make stuff and how much? Private property laws are sometimes ignored, right? And where's money? It still matters when you're buying materials, and even the ones that were donated, where obviously money was used at some time, and rent, paying rent and things like that, but less so. Different tasks and projects have different urgencies. Let's prioritize these tasks not by money, but by collective decision making. Mutual aid labor should be voluntary. Some of us will not be able to participate, though they will be receivers, and not coercive like work is coercive under capitalism. So there's a new class composition that's happening here, kind of all those job descriptions, those job titles I mentioned just a minute ago. And it's a new class that's emerging. And why class? It's like a term that's not really seen too favorably in anarchism. But there's a French feminist named Christine Delphi who argues that class is the least unsatisfactory of all the terms used to analyze oppression. Class, she says, is useful because it can refer to any relationship of domination. I'd be okay with calling class community if that's what people would prefer. The point is that we need organization, coordination, and a commitment to a common struggle, not to be dominated, and that we feel the domination of others internally, as opposed to an external one that will continue to divide what we have in common. Important point about class that's made by Hugh Farrell, who was writing about Atlanta's Defend the Forest struggle, is a piece called The Strategy of Composition, is that class is not merely a coalition of different subjects, each to whom remains the same throughout. In order for this strategy to function in practice, in order to maintain the composition of a movement, each of its components parts must be willing to step away from their identities to some degree. The aim here is not to enter into some kind of new synthesis, erasing our particularity, our uniqueness. Rather, the assumption is that in order to win, each segment must commit to its contextual form that invites all the other pieces of the movement to destabilize their identity and commitments that may have otherwise held in normally capitalist politics. It is in this way composition produces not social unity, but a practical machine fueled by the partial desubjectification of its constituent parts. So I want to define mutual aid as an everyday practice. Kropotkin said mutual aid is a necessary foundation of everyday life. It's done all the time, even if people aren't calling it mutual aid. There's a point made by the folks at Mutual Aid Disaster Relief. If all the people practicing mutual aid, either those doing it in their everyday lives informally, because humans naturally care for one another, or by using the name, were forced to cease these highest and most life-affirming humanitarian gestures, the end result would be mass starvation, mass illness, and mass death. And I really think of mutual aid as a state of mind. It's not contained, by the walls in this room or where we're organizing it. And then going back to Kropotkin, he talked about the word commune. It was a big thing, kind of a political unit during the Middle Ages. But he says that commune, for the Middle Ages, commune was an isolated state, clearly separated from others by its frontiers. For us, commune no longer means a territorial agglomeration. It is rather a generic name or a synonym for the regrouping of equals, which knows neither frontiers nor walls. But one important thing in mutual aid is both radical and pre-radical. It is happily embracing dual power, which I consider the mechanism in which to spread its wings and advance towards liberation. Dual power, says a group in Seattle, is about giving people a second option. This is where we develop our technical and political capacities, pool all our knowledges as they grow, learn more, get stronger, scale up, and again, crowd out capitalism. So what dual power is kind of what, the activation process, the kind of the petri dish for gaining political power. Word power, I think, is seen as something we often shy away from because we the only power we know we hate, right? But when we do what we do in the middle of dual power passage is that we do politics, and some really interesting things happen when we do politics. Do you have Dean Spade's book here? Yeah. So Dean Spade sees, you know, Dean has worked in the nonprofit field for a long time, and Dean writes that the nonprofit industry is a key places for leadership development, provision of survival services, political development, network building, and sustained campaigns for change that are integral skills to advancing dual power towards this more revolutionary phase. In fact, it's only through the grinding process of wading into mutual aid and actively building this new civil society that the multitude can achieve a more transformative political configuration. Politics cannot be defined on the basis of any pre-existing subject. We're not destined to do any kind of politics, especially the one that in the world we live in right now. That's not our, there's nothing in our DNA that says we have to do that. The idea of a social contract made a long time ago was made, well, a long time ago. It's lost its irrelevancy. The greatest predictor in determining the level of support for democracy in the workplace is the direct experience of workplace democracy. We must then do radical politics first and slowly in order to realize radical outcomes. So I see mutual aid as not something temporary or something small and weak, or that eventually sells out and becomes a 501c3 nonprofit that desperately does car washes and sells candy bars to fund its work. We're not just doing triage work here, but building towards something more permanent, more powerful. Anybody familiar with Cooperation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi? That was a model. I looked at 8 actual mutual aid practices, and that was one of the ones I looked at. And I found it very interesting. And it started off kind of initially engaging with the local and state governments there, but then it got big enough. It's getting big enough now that it can try to peel off, and that's always its end game is to peel off from the state altogether. And what's a fundamental piece of dual power is you're developing knowledge and technical know-how on a mass scale. And I would call all the sort of technical work that we do in mutual aid a mass science. And it's really a radical form of science. Again, a mass intelligence. In Cooperation Jackson, others are talking about taking over the supply chain. There's a group in Atlanta that I looked at that does works on food sovereignty, and their next step is they're trying to control a whole supply chain to get not just grow, not just go. How do we go beyond a garden? How do we start to look like something much bigger? And then, of course, confederalism, developing alliances across regions of the world. And what would an internet look like if it was run through mutual aid or democratically on a global scale? So I see mutual aid as a politics of the millions, a mass movement, but also a politics of optimism. And to conclude here, just a point, I come more from this, from the socialist tradition. So if you think about the first sentence in Marx's Capital, Volume 1, and this is a point made by another writer, and I could take credit for this, pointing this out, but the first sentence of Capital is the wealth of those societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails presents itself as an immense accumulation of commodities, its unit being a single commodity. So the word, there's a lot in that sentence. So the word prevails suggests something temporary. I think there's a quote that says that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. But I think Marx said that it's actually kind of hanging in there, hanging by a thread. So I think that suggests something temporary that's not always going to prevail. But I think the key part in this passage here is the first word in that sentence is wealth, is not commodity. Like power is another word we shy away from. Wealth is another word that we shy away from. But in all societies, wealth is created. It's not referring to how much you're worth, but a social wealth, a social surplus that all societies, again, have created. But how that creation of the wealth is done, what is done with that wealth, who gets it, even if they can't work, matters very much. And I think mutual aid gets that better than anyone else out there right now. Did we want to do, what was your suggestion? To temperature check, yes.
Yeah, do we want to do a temp check? Do y'all have any reflections or questions?
Otherwise, these folks can talk about the real work being done. But we go, if there's questions later, I'm happy to answer any, but I don't know who wants to go first and talk about their work, or I already spoke, so it's
I could talk, I don't mind. Yeah, so my name's Ben. I'm from around here. Yeah, I have been working with mutual aid disaster relief for going on 8 9 years now. Started off doing like food not bombs in town, and then got kind of priced out of our place we were staying. So we moved on to a school bus and turned it into a kitchen, and then drove around the Southeast trying to do like food not bombs setups all over the place. Met up with some really cool chapters, but a big part of it that I really resonated with what you were talking about was that a thing that we kept bumping into with our local food not bombs chapter was like figuring out solutions to problems, like just logistical, technical problems, like how do we schedule our pickups for our food, and having this like gnawing feeling that one of the other chapters somewhere around has figured this out already and has done this work. So part of the like point, partially because we couldn't afford to live anywhere, but also to check out the other chapters, was to try and find that like template, find that model of a food not bombs chapter, and then present it, like bring it together and give that away to people so that we could give everybody like a starter kit on how to set up a food share in your neighborhood. That kind of gave way to getting involved with mutual aid disaster relief because we had a kitchen on our bus, and we've been hitching our wagon to them ever since. Me and my spouse, who couldn't make it today, but yeah, in town. Sorry, there were some questions beforehand. That's most of the history of stuff that I've been working with locally. And then after Helene hit, we set up a supplies hub over by the tool library because we had a supply line stop there already. So we just kind of opened up the doors and got everything going. Peter here did a whole lot of work to get that going as well, and some other folks out here. But yeah, that's my 5 minute story. Was it 5 minutes?
Hi, my name is Chelsea. I'm based out of Haywood County, and I have lived in what I call the far west of Western North Carolina my whole life. So there's 7 counties west of Asheville, and I've lived in those counties, kind of hopping between them. And I have a lot less experience doing mutual aid than been here, but some of the things that resonated with me as you were speaking, David, was one, the concept of mutual aid is like an everyday action and like a lifestyle. And then two, the lack of labels that we apply to ourselves, because I found my way into community organizing at the ripe age of 18, just as a means of survival, because I was born to a 19-year-old single mom who just didn't have the means to really raise me on her own. And so I was raised by a village of folks, like had a bedroom in church members' houses and neighbors' houses. And I just thought that that was normal. Like I didn't realize that this was something that was the exception to kind of the cultural rule outside of Appalachia. And so now I've come to figure out that like we were doing mutual aid through potlucks and like childcare sharing, but we didn't know that that's what it was called. And we didn't have the words for it. And so I found my way into community organizing at large, first through like advocating for policies that I thought were going to be the key to saving my loved ones from death by for-profit healthcare and death by poverty, et cetera. And then over the course of time, figured out that, you know, we can advocate for reform as much as we want to until our lungs give out, but really the power rests within us to just start building alternatives. And I think Helene made that so clear to me, and not just what needed to happen, but what was possible, because suddenly it was possible for us all to be taking care of each other despite the middleman of money, and to just cut that out and to show up and really make this magic happen. And so I've frequently said as I've grown up, like I have never read Marx's Capital. I've never read theory. I'm not a theorist. And I haven't really had a label that has aptly applied because for me, it was just about survival. And it was just about how am I going to survive? And in the midst of that, how am I going to make sure that the people who have loved me and who I love can also survive? So, yeah.
Okay, we put together our panel put together a couple of questions. You guys okay with? Okay. I think some of this is actually we've touched upon, but you mentioned the technical, and I thought that's another great word that I think is relevant here. But if we talk about it, like I'm really interested in how it's organized. I recognize how hard it is. But if you were going to compare how mutual aid is organized differently from the standard workplace, any of us who works in nonprofits, the family, the state, what's from an organizing or governance perspective, what's so unique about mutual aid? How is it different from those other institutions?
I would say the closest thing is, and it is a little bit like we're not an organization, we're all a family here. But I think it is probably closest to some sort of extended family structure, at least in the projects I've been involved with the advantages of like being there for one another, understanding each other's like capacities and like needing to step back when necessary. And with the pitfalls of also having a over reliance on like a couple of folks that wind up in these almost parental project roles, and then more being asked of them than just about everyone else, not feeling like they can kind of step away as their capacities become extended. But yeah, the hard thing is everything takes twice as long when you have one extra person, and we invite everyone to come out. So every decision it's really hard to know when the decision is made, when the thing is actually going to happen. And so that's my kind of big takeaway is like, not a big fan of bosses, but it is nice to be able to say, oh, this decision has been made, and so we're going to do this thing. And it can be really hard with a large group of people all trying to collectively make decisions via consensus.
Yeah, I would agree with that. But I think on the flip side of that, it also moves faster than it would in a workplace. Like I think after Helene, we saw that firsthand when it's like there's all of these bureaucratic check marks that had to be checked off for a lot of people to receive assistance. And meanwhile, in mutual aid circles, it was like, okay, we're fucking going. Like there's stuff to do. We know what needs to be done. You've got this, I've got that. And so I think it's a interesting line to walk of like, yes, we're getting consensus and making decisions sometimes slowly, but it's also that process that allows us to not get bottlenecked into like waiting for one person or one process to allow us or give us permission to move forward. And I think that what you're kind of naming, Ben, for me around like we unfortunately see like one or two people kind of get seen as or like perceived in these sort of like paternalistic roles or like leadership roles is like, as we are doing through mutual aid, we're also actively unlearning this culture of hierarchy and dominance. And so it can pop up, right, in the systems that we're building. And so that need to constantly be attuned to it and that willingness to talk about it is something that I think makes mutual aid so unique. It's like we can have structures and systems, but it's constantly like recalibrating itself very organically. And it's like there's some standardization that allows us to replicate systems. Like I'll always remember the little binder that you made at the Smith Mill Hub that was like, no one's in charge, but here's some roles that have allowed this to work for us. And then I was able to take that back to my home hub in Haywood County. And we didn't replicate the exact structure that was in place at Smith Mill, but it did give us ideas for like, oh, we can streamline some of what we have been doing. So it's like structured enough that it allows us to be flexible. And it reminds me a lot of, I have a 4-year-old back home. It reminds me kind of parenting, right? It's like we create a routine, like a container that allows for safety and some level of predictability. But because of that container, there is enough sense of safety to try new things and to be flexible and to like explore the world in ways that like this rigorous, like white supremacist, capitalist systems that we've inherited don't allow us that exploration, right? Because if you deviate, then you're disposed of or you're wrong. So yeah, I would say that's what makes it different, is that it's like replicable but flexible.
I think it's interesting. Both of you mentioned the family and parenting. I think that's a really interesting point. I think one of the things, another, just singing the praises for mutual aid and what makes it so unique and so much potential is, particularly among people much younger than me, is because it's so new and so hard, like you mentioned, and going in so many new directions intentionally, and the experimentation process and setbacks and people not showing up and more work to be done, not enough resources, is one of the things I think that organizers get in mutual aid. And I put a lot of this in the book so well, is mental wellness and mental health, how critical that is to the sustainability of these organizations. I think older folks like me, just that was not something that was talked about, not something that was important. I think because it's so fundamental to the organizing that I think it's going to go, it's going to just thrive just because of that. Well, partially because of that, but I think it's a great, tactic that they have. So the next question I have is, we're in Nashville and Western North Carolina more broadly. Talked a little bit about Cooperation Jackson, and they're buying more land. They're trying to get bigger, and some of these projects are trying to expand beyond just a one kind of place thing. But this is kind of like taking our our wish list here, our imaginations in action here. But what would it take for mutual aid to be scaled up so that it becomes a significant political force in Asheville, Western North Carolina, and even beyond? What might a world with a scaled up, powerful mutual aid practice look like here in Western North Carolina, but also, what's known as the U.S. now and globally?
I think I would just what? I'm on. The microphone's on. I think one thing is like the terminology of mutual aid and like the idea as presented in the books that are coming out and kind of how it's being used is definitely new, but I think most of the bones of it are so old, and just like the basic building blocks of community and like working with one another, that like I think we have that as an advantage of like, yeah, this is a new thing, but it's also something everybody kind of knows. It's just sharing. It's just like being nice to one another, like caring about folks. Like we can wrap it in all sorts of things, but ultimately it's like looking out for each other. And that is, yeah, I really, it can be really easy to overcomplicate things. I always try to not do that whenever I can. But the scaling up thing, as far as like Cooperation Jackson, and we're doing a lot of that with mutual aid disaster relief, as well as trying to build out some of those systems. Like I really appreciated the. I meant to bring the pamphlet, but I'll give it to you. Maybe we can upload it somewhere. But of the different roles for the hub, but like those being available as breakable templates, not as rigid sets of rules, but as like a starting point, is I think what it's going to take for more organizations to be able to like share laterally with each other. One thing you said earlier was about the internet, and I'm an internet person. And so when you mentioned that, like, what would an internet look like that was non-hierarchical and more like community based, and like it would look like the internet looked in the late 90s and before everything became these like closed walled gardens. And it's still there, like the backbone of it's still all there, and I think it's going to be a huge part of it. um yeah, I think like having a shared definition of terms, like utilizing some of those tools to organize all the projects that we're doing, and giving people those options of how can we make it accessible for folks to be able to see the things that need doing for these projects and to have input on them in a way that doesn't require a 3 hour long consensus meeting on a work night when we can't actually work out childcare and only a very few people actually get to show up to do it. Like the more that we can open up those barriers and let more and more folks in, like I don't think we can fail if we continue to work towards getting more and more folks involved, because then you do have that ability to step back and not burn yourself out.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And I think that, again, we're unlearning while we're inventing new ways of being. And so I think typically in our culture, we think of scale up as like this big centralized scale up underneath an umbrella, right? And actually, since I've had the privilege of being involved with mutual aid disaster relief and the various projects on the ground, what I keep likening it to is a mycelium network of like, it isn't scaling up from the center, it's scaling up as kind of these confederated groupings, right? And so one thing that, as I'm in the far west, it feels often like Asheville's a mecca of this kind of organizing out here. And so one of the things that I've kind of taken to is like, okay, what pieces of wisdom and network and resources can I like draw from Asheville and bring into the far west so that we can have our little node of the mycelium network out here? And in doing that, I've been able to plug into kind of Southeast regional at large like nodes that exist. So folks down in Atlanta with warehouses of supplies that are being staged. We've got our friends out in Raleigh. And I think the scale is naturally and organically building, but it's not building in the way that we're used to seeing things be built in our current circumstances. And so the like way for us to continue to scale things, whether it's in Western North Carolina or Appalachia or the Southeast or across America, is like focus on our neighborhood and our community. And then from there, connect, right? Like I'm connected with Ben, so I'm able to kind of like, and with Liberty and Firestorm. And so I'm able to know that I can lean on them outside of my immediate periphery in my community for those additional resources, for the mental health support when I'm like, I have no idea what I'm doing. Can someone please help me? But I think that's really the way forward. And then also, when we do that, we aren't kind of replicating what has been the downfall of a lot of the social justice nonprofit industrial complex, which is the like targeted recruitment of audiences and communities in particular pockets, right? If we just focus on our own neighborhood and our own community, then we're going to be casting a much wider net, and we're not going to be like assigning worthiness in the same way that even some of these like I said, like social justice organizations would, where they're like, oh, we're only going to focus on people who share our messaging and our values. If we're just focusing on meeting the needs of our neighbors, we're going to be pulling in a lot of folks that otherwise might be pulled in by like the alt-right when they are left without anyone to meet their needs and they feel like they are targeted and disposed of by their own communities. So
Just anybody have any questions for we have one more question prepared, but does anybody have a yes?
I struggle a lot with the like boundary between where we're able to keep doing mutual aid work and then where if you trace it back far enough, like someone has to spend money on something or we have to do some sort of fundraising or I don't like there has to be like donate like even like you said like when stuff is donated at some point you like trace it back and it's still part of this bigger tapestry of capitalism and I don't know like I don't understand how to ethically scale up or like expand. I don't know, I'm just curious if you have like I'm curious about I'm clear on like the limitations of trying to create new systems within the shitty current one, but I'm more curious about like how to push the limits of them because I keep coming up against them, and I'm like, where's that? Where can I like blur that? Does that make sense?
Sure.
I think so. So are you saying, just for the recording, like eventually everything comes back to the best way to meet people's needs sometimes is just making an Amazon.com order and getting the cat food to the folks, and like that's I I don't know the answer to that question of like where that actually is. I think there are wider connections that can be made because ultimately somebody is growing that food and, well, probably slaughtering that food for cat food, but like getting the ingredient, someone who's another person who also needs their needs met is making those things that then get filtered through Amazon and Walmart to do the stuff. And like as we are able to expand out laterally, then we can kind of cut out some of those pieces. I think I'm gonna keep harking on it because I'm a systems nerd, but like it needs to be as easy to get your needs met through our ways to do it as it is to make an Amazon order, or it needs to not, yeah, like we just need, it's really hard to get your needs met without resulting to
a little bit. No, I think it is. I think this is the line that we're walking, right? Of building the new world and killing the old one off at the same time. And I think, so I don't know that there is an answer right now around like we can scale out within a month to never have to, place an order from Amazon ever again. But I think it's more about like recognizing and chipping away at the places where we do currently rely on those structures. So like I think the repair cafe is a really great example of this. Is like, oh, if we can repair the things that normally would go into a landfill where people would then turn around and buy new things, right? Like that's one way that we're chipping away at this sort of like consumerist culture, right? And when we think about it less as like specific one-off tangible acts like ordering off of Amazon or purchasing a gas card for someone, and we think about it more as this cultural shifting, then we can start to think about like, okay, how, as we are weaving these mutual aid networks, in what ways are we also like changing this culture that like looks at individuals and at our material goods as like disposable, and creates this like cycle of disposability, consumerism of each other, of our labor, this exploitation and extraction. And so like recently, inspired by Asheville, we had a really, really free market out in Waynesville. And one thing that I kept saying to folks who were showing up, because it was a great model of like different folks who identify as different classes being in the same space. So like folks who might identify as more middle class, even though, we know that probably doesn't even exist anymore, versus like folks who identify as poor and working class and struggling, like being in the same space as opposed to like charity receivers and charity givers, and they're all giving and they're all taking. And I kept reiterating for folks, like, even if you don't think that you are someone who is in need, if you're able to take some of the things that you would normally buy from a big box store, like if you would normally get your shampoo and your deodorant, et cetera, from Walmart, and you're able to get that here in this room, and that gives you an extra $30 to spend in your local economy, then we're still generating, like, that is still a win from this whole event, even in addition to meeting the immediate needs. And so starting to think about things like, how do we shift the culture away from like, we're so used to being able to go to Amazon to get our needs met, et cetera, and start rethinking about like, how do we build a storage capacity, right, of things that folks are going to need on the fly. And that's been part of like my big mission. It's both a problem, but also I think it's a strength maybe around like, I just can't say no and like let things go to waste if I know that there's like a warehouse being cleaned out, or there's things that are going to end up in the landfill, and someone says like, hey, does anyone have space for this? I'm like, yeah. even though I definitely don't have space for it, like I'll figure it out somehow. But because of that, like now this just sort of mindset of like, yes, there's plenty to go around. I'll figure out the space. Like now we have a storage unit in Haywood County that's got just like stacks of baby wipes. And so anytime someone's like, hey, we need baby wipes, it's just like, it's there, we've got it. And so we were starting to build this sort of like overstock almost of these basic things that we can then get through the community, in part because we had the nodes of our mycelium mutual aid network out in Raleigh who were like, our warehouse is getting ready to shut down. Where can we send these things? And so I think the scale and the like countering that you're talking about, like the killing off of the old culture, like comes through like constant communication, right? And just like constantly doing what you can in the moment and being really intentional about like, okay, how are we countering the culture in addition to just meeting the immediate needs? That was a long ramble. I'm sorry.
No, I think I mean, your question is a reminder of like the most important thing in political theory is the question. not the answer, but in these answers, I mean, I think you hear transformation, but transformation that's happening at a molecular level and going all the way up. I mean, I wrote a bit about the Zapatistas, and the Zapatistas started when I was in high school. I'm almost 50 years old now, and they first said no to the Mexican state. And then recently decided not to take any funding from foundations, nonprofits. But that was recent. So they're still sort of going strong 30 years later, figuring things out. I think this work, just even a small behavioral change is going to take a long time. And I know sometimes we feel like we don't have the time. That's the whole other thing. Sometimes a week seems, in our political world we're living right now, sometimes a week seems like an eternity. But I think this work is really, multi-decade work. I mean, that's just my guess. I don't think you can guess anything. It could maybe, ideally, it would change next week, but it's so hard just to have, our habits modified. But when we practice them, we see that they do change, and I think that's having a panel with people who are practitioners enriches this any kind of theoretical talk, because it just shows you transformation is happening. That's a great question. Any other questions before we do our last one?
And like mutual aid. I feel like we don't talk about it very often, but like scaling up mutual aid necessarily involves expropriation. Sure. Yeah, I guess my thought on this was just that I feel like maybe we don't talk about it often enough, but there's a degree to which like scaling up mutual aid and beginning to think of it in relation to dual power also involves a process of expropriation. And I think ultimately, like so many resources that have been produced by working people have been captured and have to be recaptured. And you see this in like really mundane ways with so many people doing organizing work. Doing that work on like stolen, quote unquote, stolen time, right? Like at their like office jobs. I mean, I don't know how many zines are being produced right now in office places and nonprofits. But I mean, even looking at, like you mentioned the Black Panther Party, an enormous amount of the programs they were doing were funded through bank expropriations. So I think beginning to think about like, yes, we need resources that are currently locked up within capitalism. And maybe that involves sometimes buying them on Amazon, but probably it also involves finding ways to take them back.
Yeah, ideas, it's all on the table, right? And the tactics and discovering. And the last question, again, kind of staying with our crystal ball theme here, is what's the future of mutual aid? Where may it go over the next 4 years and beyond, and where does it need to go?
I think that mutual aid needs to go. When we were in the midst of Helene, and folks could literally, there was a pop-up clinic here in Asheville that I met an actual physician at who was doing their thing on the streets. And we could get food and water and usually hot meals. At one point, I was saying like I was eating better on the mutual aid diet than I would if I was responsible for cooking for myself, and it's still true. Um, and I think that like that is like mutual aid needs to go to where it just is so accessible that like it just overrides the dominant culture, right? Like if there it especially once the election ended up happening, I felt insane because I was like looking around at people working these jobs that wouldn't even exist if it was not for capitalism. My job doing clinical documentation, where I was like literally just checking insurance boxes. And it was like, wait, why are we doing this? Like, why are we pretending that any of this is real? Money's not real. This economy is not real. The things that are real are the food that we put in our bellies, the roof that's over our head, the people that will take care of us when we need it the most. And so I think that like where mutual aid needs to go is like demonstrating what is real, like constantly, to the point where people feel crazy for buying into the alternatives. And yeah, I think that in the next 4 years, at least where my mind has gone to is like I'm preparing now for what inevitably is going to be off the table for folks to get, right? Like there's a table over here of stuff if y'all need it. It's all free. Like I am backstocking Plan B, naloxone. I'm thinking of food and toiletries and just like basic necessities that folks are either not going to have access to because they're going to be outlawed or because the price is going to go up so much that it's going to be unattainable. And I think that like absolutely in the next 4 years, if we're thinking about what people need to survive, like there's a lot of opportunity for us to go ahead and start getting those items for ourselves and for our neighbors. And I think in addition to that, knowing your neighbors, like that's the one of the biggest resources, that social wealth I think you were calling it. It's like the community and the people around you. If you can't afford gas to get out of your town, like it doesn't matter if you hate your neighbors or not, like you're going to need to know who they are. So building those networks now and like showing up for folks. And honestly, like if you make extra dinner, like invite people over for dinner, start showing people that you will show up for them, so that way when you need them to show up for you, they already know that that's the kind of relationship that y'all have.
Yeah, and I think just like one thing that I think about a lot is specifically with the immediate aftermath of Helene, and I've responded to a couple of different hurricanes and tornadoes and whatnot, but this is the first one in my home. And like from the jump, there was such that picture, like you were saying, of what was actually real. When everything fell apart, there's this moment where folks can come together and practice spontaneous mutual aid of just everybody's gonna move the buckets of water. Everybody's going to like unload the truck because they happen to be around and it's full of bottled water and canned food, and we're gonna get it out to folks and we're just gonna make it happen. And we're not going to worry about all of the made up stuff and worry about the rent that's going to be due eventually, because it's not the thing. And it's that like that moment, and it's a flash of what community could be in a world that didn't have to work under all of the other constraints of the markets and capitalism and rents and landlords and a job. And I think one thing that might be unique to the folks around here that are used to kind of dreaming of that world is a very particular second amount of grief that we get as rent comes due, and that actually means something again, and the regular world starts clawing its way back into a free community that we had for a minute. And it wasn't worth the price, I don't think, for a couple of weeks of looking after each other in a way that we could always. But every time we get a glimpse of it in those disaster areas, the picture comes a little bit clearer, and we're able to hold on to that for a little bit longer and build those systems a little bit stronger for the inevitable next one. And as our like institutions are crumbling more and more, then we're going to be able to use that experience and these experiences that we're going to have and stuff that we don't know about now that we're going to know about next week to build out those systems of looking after each other. Because it is a little bit, at least in my like super optimistic to a fault mind, like it is kind of the default that folks look after each other when stuff goes wrong, and we're going to keep doing it.
So the best political theory is made in the movement. You know, I think that's evident. Those are all our questions. I don't know if anybody wanted to ask anything more before we wrap up.
Yeah. So the question was about the Repair Cafe. Yeah, it's called WNC Repair Cafe. They partner with the Tool Library a good bit. They have a website, just wncrepaircafe.com, and they do like pop-up events in Buncombe and beyond. So like they've come out to Haywood Community College, and it's all volunteers. So it's folks who volunteer their time to do basic household repairs, and anyone can bring stuff. And if they can repair it, I think they've got like a 90 to 95% success rate. And then sometimes they'll do like fabric mending specific days. So it's like anything that can be fixed with thread you can bring, and they have people who can sew and will repair like chairs or buttons and all kinds of stuff. And then the other days, it's like any sort of small household appliance, furniture. And they've started doing, I think, like workshops, right, around like how to repair your bike and some other kind of maintenance things like that. So if you check out their website, wncrepaircafe.com, and I think they've started posting a calendar of where they're going to be. Yeah, absolutely.
Any other questions? Okay.
Well, this is one thing that I really appreciate about Firestorm is they almost always will post like childcare available, upon request with their events. And I think it's something that we just all, I mean, I could go on a whole tangent about like accessibility for folks with children in like left spaces and social justice spaces in general. And I think that it's something that we like, if what we are doing is building a new way of being in community with each other, we have to be prepared to include everyone in the community, including our elders, including our folks with mobility struggles, including children. And so if we are ourselves organizing some kind of gathering or meetup or whatever, like we need to be thinking, is this a child friendly thing? If not, how can we arrange childcare? There are folks in our movement circles who are great with children, who are happy. I was doing a workshop a few weeks ago, and I just reached out to one of them and was like, hey, I would love to pay you for a couple of hours of childcare if you're able to cover it for this workshop. And then I think also like naming it when there are spaces that are not accessible to us as parents, like naming that, right, and being like, hey, I would really have loved to come to this, but I cannot because I have a small child, and if I were to join, then I would just be so distracted trying to wrangle my kiddo, or asking, like I've asked, in a couple of spaces, like, is this friendly for kids? And then that might be just exactly what the organizers need to think about it, right? And so, yeah, I don't know that there's a perfect answer, but I think the intentionality is kind of how can we help others be intentional and aware, but then also how can we bring that intentionality and awareness to our own spaces? Sometimes it's just about bringing some bubbles and and your own kid, and kind of making sure that there's a model for it. Yeah.
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 I think like the the like the business guy version of it is that you can't improve what you don't track, is like the grind set sort of thing. And so if folks aren't like conscious of the fact that, hey, this is an actual issue and it's a barrier, like it takes people talking about it, and that inspires the figuring out how what the system is.
Yes.
I have to remember what it is. So the question is, I think a lot of emphasis gets put on the idea of mutual aid as something revolutionary and capable of, generating a new social form. And I think one of the things that people or one of the examples that or points that people bring in to sort of demonstrate that is the power of mutual aid in terms of meeting people's needs in everyday life. And there was that quote that like if all of the sort of informal mutual aid that's practiced all the time just stopped, society would come grinding to a halt. But I think implicit in that statement is the idea that there is some measure of mutual aid that goes into stabilizing the social structure as it is right now. Because, if the state was literally responsible for meeting all of your needs and you couldn't get things informally, that would generate a lot more opposition whenever that, the failures come. So my question is, what is the difference between the form of informal mutual aid that is sort of plays that stabilizing role versus mutual aid acting in a more revolutionary way? Like how can the revolutionary potential of it be realized against its sort of stabilizing function?
Let me go. Let's try to answer that, or
I mean, I have thoughts, but I talked a lot in the last one.
okay. You mind if I go first? I think that's possibly the the hardest question to answer right now is scaling up. There are very few examples of it, of anybody operating a truly pure autonomous form. I think mutual aid right now is so early in its trajectory. And that's why I looked at not like the 1917 Soviets, but the 1905 Soviets, and you see glimpses of it, but it's still very much constrained. I think that was a word that, that Ben used, was constrained. And looking at it as sort of being in exile right now is, exiled from not quite anywhere. You're not, and dual power was another important sort of concept for me, because dual power is still living within the system. You're not even close to taking over the system. But I think your point is really interesting, is where do you draw the line? And like, hey, we're actually keeping this all together. We're keeping this system all together the more mutual aid we do. And I haven't thought about that. I don't know what, where the separation is, where's that point that you identify on the, on the roadmap for where the tipping point, so to speak. In my book, I sort of made some assumptions, historical kind of projections, which I hate to do because you just don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. But I sort of did a lot of forecasting that collapse is inevitable, and whether or not people believe that, or I wish it wasn't, made my sort of point a little bit easier to make. Is like, hey, this other stuff's just going to crumble. It's just no longer, people want to live, and they're going to find a way to renew themselves, their loved one, their neighbors, strangers, you know, and they're going to find a way. But I did make this kind of little neat assumption that collapse is going to sort of answer some of these things. It's just, I don't know, but it's the hardest question. That's why I was so interested in the scaling up and getting political power, what political power looks like that's truly independent. But I think your point is really an interesting one about, damn, this is actually, we're doing somebody else's work and they're not doing anything for us. So great question. Yeah.
That was a very fantastic question. And I think I agree with a lot of what you were saying there. I think I might commit a little bit of anarchistic heresy, but on a daily kind of mindset, I don't give a shit about a capital R revolution or tearing down the system half as much as I care about people having food and a place to stay dry when it rains and to have needs met. And so whether or not that is done in with a circle A flag around it, or it's a political party, or it's hammer and sickle, or it's whoever, if it's the church, churches do a lot of mutual aid programs. I grew up in it and was how we, you were saying, how a lot of our needs were met. And that lowercase m, lowercase a mutual aid, I think is the mechanic that is the through line throughout that as we're building dual power community wide and we're meeting the needs of folks, then it's not so much that we're going to overthrow some big bad as the more that it renders their ability to meet people's needs obsolete, and the more that we're able to do that with amongst ourselves and with each other, then that is what their power is, right? The state controlled, yes, they have violence, but they also have organization, they have roads, they have crews, they have schedules, they have all these things that we do rely on in order to just live in a society. And I think we can do that better. I think we have done that better in fits and starts. And that's just, I feel like, what we're gonna keep doing.
Yeah, Ben, I think making what the state fails to do for us obsolete is the end goal. I think, sure, some of our mutual aid efforts will start as a means of meeting our own needs in the wake of the state's failure, and thus will kind of maintain the state's ability to fail in that way. But that is where it starts, and that's not necessarily where it has to end, right? It can then exceed what the state would is ever possible of providing for us. And I think about the Battle of Blair Mountain often when I'm thinking about mutual aid, because it is akin to, now we're seeing all of these calls for a general strike now. And what happened in the Battle of Blair Mountain is that there was this call for direct action, right? This push against what the workers were having to go through when they were literally living in towns provided by the companies. Their housing was provided by the companies. Their fake money script was provided by the companies, the general store, et cetera. And so they knew if they were going to be able to launch a big R revolutionary attack on the coal barons, that they were going to have alternatives to that, right? And so it's very likely that a lot of the mutual aid that they relied on was actually started when they were still relying mostly on what the company could provide. And so they were having to take care of each other's kids because the company wouldn't provide childcare. They were having to figure out how to feed each other because the company wasn't paying them enough to actually buy sustainable food for their families. But then it was only through those networks that they were able to say, like, okay, we're building an alternative to this, so that when we inevitably lose our housing because we are striking workers, we will have somewhere to go. We will be able to afford to feed ourselves, et cetera. And so it's like, it is that dual power mechanism. We may be building it in such a way that it is allowing the state to do what it's doing right now because we have to survive in this moment. But by building something outside of the state's authority, that's how we can, overcome the state's influence in our lives. And I think a big part of it for me, like what it comes down to, is the informed consent piece of it. Like, I think when we are forced to provide unpaid labor as a means of survival, often what the state is like relying on is like, oh, there's no alternative. This is just the way it is. This sort of messaging of like, there's no way for us to actually provide informed consent because they just take away any sort of alternatives options that we might have had. But mutual aid is creating an alternative and is introducing, like, we can have a choice in this. And these are what the choices can look like. And I think that's really what creates a different path.
Some great questions. Hi. Sure.
One of the things that I feel I see almost barrier to that
So just for the online folks, question, if I get it right, the distinction between receiving help versus receiving community, would that be accurate? Okay, how to encourage folks to be recipients and engage. Yeah, I'll let you two.
I mean, there's a big social norm to not, I don't need that. Somebody else needs it, right? Somebody else needs it worse. I don't want to take something that's going to go to someone else. It's real prevalent. My day job is I do free home repair for folks through Asheville Habitat. And so we're like constantly bumping up against like, no, we're here, we have tools, we have materials, we have money. Let us fix this thing. And they're like, no, it's just the hole in the floor that actually needs fixed. I don't need you to fix the windows that are actively leaking. It's just this thing. And so there's just a constant version of that. Like I don't know if there's a one size fits all solution, but as far as like phrases, you mentioned like having specific phrases and things, I usually will just default to like, hey, we got to take care of each other. Like, right in the early days of the Smith Mill Works Hub, like one of the things I was saying all the time when people would say thank you for getting stuff was, I don't know why you're thanking me. This is all your stuff. Like, these are your things that are in this building that I'm carrying around. Like, don't thank me. Grab the thing and take it if you can. Like, this is all your stuff. This is all of our stuff. This is already yours. I'm not giving you anything. Come and take it. And that it didn't work great, but sometimes it was helpful.
Yeah, I think the two things that I see it's for me, I'm always like, okay, what is the cultural piece here that's happening? It's shame and scarcity, right? It's like there's so much shame and there's so much scarcity. And those are the two things that we have to fight against. And I think so this was in Helene, this was the second climate crisis that we've had in Haywood County. The first one was in 2021. Tropical Storm Fred came through, and we saw a lot of this mindset of like the shame of asking for help, but then two, the fear around scarcity and like, no, someone else needs it more. I don't need it as bad as they need it. And so a couple of the things that we started learning worked were, one, kind of like forcing a little bit of help on people at first, as bad as it sounds, but like, so in Crusoe, what we would did in 2021 is we would send folks out, first of all, with supplies, because it's like in the gorge. So we would send people out into the just hills, and we would send them with hot food and cold drinks. And so when they got there, they were instructed to be like, hey, I've got this for you, and like set down the hot food and the cold drinks. And then from there, be like, okay, do you also need anything else in my car? Is kind of like getting that first yes from someone, and giving them the chance to consent to it, but also kind of like proactively knowing that they might turn it down just because of the culture. And then I think the second thing is combating that scarcity message by similar to the dropping hot food, but telling them like, no, like we have so much of this stuff. If we don't get it out of here, they're going to stop bringing us these big deliveries. We've got to just like get rid of it, like basically like psychological, like figuring out what it is that will get the scarcity either out of someone's mind or get it to like not have as much weight as it was having. And so, and also telling them like, we need you to have it because you might run into someone who needs it. And so if you've got it, then they don't have to come all the way down to us to get what we've got down there, And so, and then slowly but surely, like people, one of my like mottos is like show up for people again and again and again, because eventually that like shame starts to have less power, and that like scarcity mindset has less power. We went from doing a free market in Haywood County to now we have a free store that's open like periodically. And like literally we had a mom come in, and it's run by Haywood County Pride. So we are like very open about like, this is clear and trans friendly. And this mom came in and she's just like, thank you. Like I could cry because anytime I go to get like charity services, like people are so judgmental and so mean to me that like I stopped going entirely, but y'all are just here. And asking folks also what they have to offer is a big way to give them agency in the situation. So like with that mom, I was like, yeah, no, like, of course, we're so glad that you're here. If you happen across any clothes hangers, we're drowning in clothes, we could sure use them. And so she's like so excited to be able to contribute something like clothes hangers, right? And so giving folks that chance to engage in reciprocity can break through some of that too, because then they don't feel, I think, that like sense of, oh, they're watching me take, and viewing me as a taker in this moment.
Anybody else? Another great question. Any other? Did you want to wrap? Okay.
Awesome. This has been a great conversation. And I just want to invite folks to stick around and chat a little more. Firestorm's going to continue to be open. There's no rush. Yeah, definitely grab a copy of David's book up by the register. If you'd like to take one home, you might even be able to get David to sign it for you. And yeah, just maybe another big round of applause for our local organizers and for David. It's been an awesome conversation.